Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Puget Sound, those who are here in person, as guests, students, faculty, and staff, and those joining us from across the country and beyond. My name is Dave Wright. I use him and they pronouns, and I have the honor to serve as the chair of the Swope Endowed Lectures. As we begin this evening, I want to gratefully honor and acknowledge that this university and those of us gathered here in person are on the traditional lands of the Puyallup tribe. The Puyallup people have lived on and stewarded these lands since the beginning of time, and continue to do so today. They live, work, raise their children, care for their community, practice traditional ways, and speak the Lushootseed language, just as their ancestors did. We recognize that land acknowledgements such as this are only one small part of the journey towards true allyship. And we commit at Puget Sound to uplifting the voices, experiences, and histories of the indigenous peoples of this land and beyond. I'm particularly grateful tonight that representatives from the Puyallup tribe were able to join with Dr. Kimmerer and other guests for dinner tonight, and the guests from the Muckleshoot tribe and tribal school were able to join us for lunch today. Thank you to those community members who were part of those meals and all those who have joined us in this special place. The Swope Lectures were created through a generous gift by the family of Jane Hammer Swope, Puget Sound class of 1942, to honor their commitment to Puget Sound and the desire that we would continue to engage in issues of faith, ethics, values, and religion, important traditions drawn from their own identity as Methodists. It has been 5 years since the Swope Committee, building on those values, began to discuss inviting Robin Wall Kimmerer to campus. It has been 2 years since we chose this night out of a dartboard kind of date process, hoping that we would be here, and we are. I want to briefly thank all those who've made this journey possible these last years. The students, faculty, staff, alumni, and community partners who helped think through and dream this day. I particularly want to thank those who are working tonight, often behind the scenes, to make this possible. Staff from the Lager Store, Schneebeck Concert Hall, catering, and the chaplaincy have been working throughout the day to bring us to this moment. Thank you to those working tonight and to all those whose energy and effort have made tonight what it will be for us. Following Dr. Kimmerer's remarks tonight, my faculty colleague, Catherine Crocker, will join Dr. Kimmerer on stage to share questions curated from the audience. Hopefully you got some index cards on your way in. If not, 2 of our student leaders will be circulating a couple of times during the lecture with baskets to receive questions and to give you fresh cards if you have additional questions. Thank you to Professor Rachel DeMotz for also helping curate those as she and Dr. Crocker work to help host the questions and be in conversation with our guest. Almost done. After the lecture, those who are able, please stay with us for a reception and book signing. The reception and book signing are in the Wheelock Student Center and the Rotunda. For those who are guests to the campus, you can go out the main doors you came in and turn left and follow the crowd, or ask almost anybody who looks like they're probably in the 18 to 24 age range. Many of those folks here are probably students here. I hope you'll be able to join us for this. Drew Kirchhoff joined the University of Puget Sound as our provost prior to the start of the previous school year, and as I remembered in talking with him earlier, our first discussion was about this event. He had the chance to meet Dr. Kimmerer at a previous institution, and throughout this year we've had multiple chances to partner for major lectures and events, and I am very grateful to Provost Drew Kirchhoff for his leadership and his involvement with these sorts of wonderful programs for campus, and want to invite him up to welcome you on behalf of the university. Provost.
Thank you, Dave. Good evening, everyone. I'm Drew Kirchhoff. Like Dave said, I'm the provost here at Puget Sound. On behalf of the faculty and the rest of the campus community and those of you all watching online, I want to welcome all of you, especially our honored guest, Dr. Robin Wall Kimmerer. As a plant ecologist myself, I found in Dr. Kimmerer's writing a profound sense of recognition and a delightful sense of invitation. Through powerful storytelling, she helped me to recognize that a truly ecological understanding of the natural world and our place in it grows most fruitfully not just from a sense of curiosity and reason, but from a deep love and respect for the plants, animals, and living systems that are our most important ecological teachers. In the face of the environmental devastation we have wrought, she invites us to move from alienation to naturalization. to build upon the insights of indigenous peoples, to envision a new way of living that recognizes the land, water, and natural ecosystems as the source of all human sustenance. We are honored to have Dr. Kimmerer here on our campus to share with us the gifts of her thoughts and stories. To introduce our speaker, I would now like to invite to the stage Assistant Professor of Biology, Dr. Catherine Crocker. Thank you.
It's really bright up here. Hawe Hanyali, Kanza Ata, Jaje Witache, Mushuska, Jaje Witache, Catherine Crocker. Hello, everyone. I'm a citizen of the Claude Nation of the lands currently known as Oklahoma, and my English name is Catherine Crocker. I'm glad to be here. And I usually refrain from using the word honor in settler colonial contexts, especially in contexts of indigenous sovereignties and environmental justice, because in those contexts, the word is often so empty. But I'm really delighted to be making an exception this evening, because it's a tremendous honor to this university to be hosting such a tremendous presence. Personally, I'm honored past expression to be introducing a person who has created space within biology and within science for so many of her younger relatives and colleagues. I don't know how many of you know this, how many of you who are here tonight who are watching from farther away, but without her, very few indigenous scholars would be able to connect our work with our identities. She has created that space. Without her, the work of myself and many of my colleague relatives would be a much, much lesser thing. And so I want to say to her, although she's not out here yet, thank you for bringing us this far. Wiblahan and wehuina. So now, it is a pleasure and an honor to introduce you to a leader and a scholar who doesn't need an introduction. Member of the Citizen Potawatomi Nation, a celebrated author, a decorated scholar, distinguished teaching professor, and the founder and director of the Center for Native Peoples and the Environment at SUNY ESF, Dr. Robinwall Kimmerer.
Miigwech for that beautiful introduction. Thank you so much. Ani, bojo indinwe maganadok, shabadas gegish kokwen nadeshnakos, bodwe wad mikwenda, megazedo dem minwa makodo dem, shishibanyek nebendegwes shoni Oklahoma, miigwech kinegego gamijong. And in our beautiful Potawatomi language, of which I am just a beginning student, I give you greetings, all of my relatives, and tell you that I am a member of the Citizen Potawatomi Nation, of the Bear Clan, and also of the Eagles. And I am so grateful to be with you here today. It is, oops, they didn't change, so let me see, I'll do it that way. Okay. It is also our way that we always begin with gratitude. And I know that you've had a busy day and probably rushing to get here tonight to get your seat or your place on the couch at home if you are watching the live stream. So can we just take a moment to really be present and to remember that this morning when we first put our feet on Shkakmikwe, on Mother Earth, that she gave us everything that we need. That first breath of morning air, a drink of cool water, the sound of geese in the sky, the presence of beloved faces around us, the gift of being part of a learning community, and the gift to be guests in the homelands of the first peoples of the Salish Sea. And so as we give thanks to Mother Earth, we also think about how can we live in such a way that when our words of thanks to her are ended, the earth might be grateful for us. I like to begin by telling you a little bit about where I'm from, on the other side of Turtle Island. I am Potawatomi, enrolled in the Citizen Potawatomi. Our homelands are in the Great Lakes, but our reservation of my nation is in Shawnee, Oklahoma. But I am blessed today to live in Haudenosaunee territory, Six Nations, Iroquois, as some people used to call them. Right over the back hill from where I live is the Onondaga Nation that you see on the map. And as a Potawatomi woman living in Haudenosaunee territory, I'm so grateful for the warm embrace of my neighbors and everything that I have learned. But you know, Potawatomi people and Haudenosaunee people have a long historic relationship. I want to tell you just a little bit more about where I come from. And you see here in this beautifully borderless map of the Great Lakes that the Haudenosaunee, the Six Nations, in what is today called upstate New York, is where I live today. But we have contiguous territories with Anishinaabe people, the Anishinaabe Confederacy, which includes the Potawatomi, the Odawa, and the Ojibwe, all of us together. And long, long before settlers ever came here, our two confederacies, sharing this beautiful, well-watered homeland, had to decide how it is that we would live together. So we had international diplomacy, international agreements at that time. And when we were talking about how will we share this homeland with different languages, with different traditions, what we entered into was this historic agreement known as the Nalgan Gebejik Emkwan, the dish with one spoon treaty belt. And what you're looking at here in this document, written in wampum beads made of quahog shells, is in the center of the white field. You see the purple shape, no? That is the shape of our traditional birch bark feast dishes. And in that dish, in being represented in this agreement, we say that while we live, we are different nations, we are all fed from the bowl that Mother Earth fills for us. This is a recognition of all of those gifts that Mother Earth gives to us, and that we agree as different nations that we have a shared responsibility to keep that bowl full, to keep that bowl clean, to not deplete it. And then you see in the center of that dish, you see the white implement, and that's the emkwan. That's the spoon. And notice that there is an agreement between two different nations, but there is Bejik Emkwan. There's one spoon for two nations. So that means this is an agreement about sharing, isn't it? This is an agreement about justice. And I'll talk a little bit about justice this evening. There's not a big spoon for some people and a little spoon for others. We all have the same size and access to the gifts of Mother Earth and the same responsibilities. And you know, despite the fact that Mother Earth fills this bowl for us on a daily basis, we also know that we are tied, indeed embedded in, complicit in a rapacious economy, which is constantly asking, what more can we take from Mother Earth, despite everything that she gives to us so freely? And it seems to me that rather than asking, what more can we take from Mother Earth, the question that we need is, what does the Earth ask of us? How is it that in this time we can keep that bowl full? Now, the Nalgan Gebejik Emkwan, the dish with one spoon treaty belt, has been called the oldest sustainability policy on the planet. So you've studied it, right? It's on the first page of your sustainability courses. And I know by your laughter, even though I cannot see your faces in these bright light, keep laughing, then I'll know you're there and awake. You know that we don't study this. And this is the fact of erasure of indigenous knowledge. Why don't you know that? Why, for example, when I said to you this evening, bonjour, how many of you thought I was speaking French rather badly? raise your hands, I know, right? But mustn't we also ask ourselves, how is it that we feel greater facility in critiquing someone's French accent, a language from across the ocean, than we know the languages of this place? This too is Indigenous erasure, and it is the work of learning environments like the University of Puget Sound, like every institution of higher education here on Turtle Island, to combat erasure of Indigenous knowledge. And I elevate that challenge to you in your community. What does the earth ask of us? In my tradition, my cultural tradition, we say that all beings, in return for the gift of being here on earth, were given gifts to carry with us here. But those gifts also come with responsibilities. Just like the salmon were given that gift of swimming upstream, finding their way home, they were given the responsibility of feeding the people and feeding the land. The stars were given that gift of sparkle at night and the responsibility to remind us of our stories, right? And so each of us have our own gifts that have come to us. The land showers us with gifts, and we should be asking, how do we reciprocate those gifts of the land? What can we give back in return for all that we have been given? And the ways that we can answer that question are myriad. Every one of you has a different gift and a different set of responsibilities. But, you know, I like to think about it sort of in this word cloud of what are our gifts and responsibilities. We'll talk about just a few of them tonight. Gratitude as our first responsibility, making justice, our ability to do good science, our ability to make transformative art. These are all gifts that we have that we can give back in return for the gifts of the land. But because we are largely an audience of learners, hope we're always learners, to think about education as an important gift and a responsibility that we have. What does it mean to be an educated person? You came here for learning. You came here because you value education. And I'm thinking about one night sitting around a fire at a tribal gathering, and quite honestly, I was getting teased pretty badly for having a PhD in botany. Because I was sitting with plant knowledge holders, many of whom had a high school education, and they knew so much more about plants than I did, and such rich, deep knowledge. You can see why they were teasing me. So we got to talking, but well, what does it mean to be educated? It isn't the letters after your name. It isn't your years in college or even your years on the land. And one of the elders gave me this guidance that I use and share with my students all the time, so I want to share it with you. And that is that an educated person is somebody who knows what their gifts are and has learned how to give them to the world. And that's what I wish for you. Rarely do we see this on our syllabi. But you know what? I put it on all of mine now. Yes, my students still have to learn all the names of the plants, but this is what I really want them to know. What are their gifts, and how will they give them? And the gift that we can give back to the land that I was asked to talk about tonight is this gift of using our art, our science, all of our abilities for healing the land, for the gift of ecological restoration. And I'll talk a little bit about what does this mean. Because we know that in this time, because of the huge footprint that we have had as a species, it is no longer enough just to conserve the remnants of the living world that remain to us, right? It's not enough. We have to heal the damage that we have done. We have to enact environmental justice with the land. And you know, I was really so thrilled to learn from Dave. At the hotel that I'm staying in, right down the way in Tacoma, is an example of that kind of restoration. That it used to be a brownfield, it used to be a Superfund site, and is now this beautiful park for recreation and cultural celebration. That's what the earth asks of us. Clean up after ourselves and make beauty and community around us. And so tonight I will be trying to have us think about together ecological restoration as a way of answering that question of what does the earth ask of us. I think of this as doing dishes in Mother Earth's kitchen. We have had the feast, right? We have had the feast, and now it's time that we clean up. But that sounds perhaps like a chore, but anybody who's been in the kitchen after a feast knows that that's where the fun happens. It is also a joyful undertaking to clean up together, to have that collective responsibility and the collective joy. But, before we get into talking about how restoration could work and does work, we have to think together that the approach that we take to healing the land depends on what we think land is, the meaning of land. And so in this audience, where many of you have grown up with the invisible paradigm of the Western worldview, let's think together about what we mean in Western society, American society, about what does land mean. Do this little thought experiment with me, if you would. Land is often thought of as almost synonymous with natural resources, isn't it? I teach at a college of environmental science and forestry where natural resources is the language we use. It sounds pretty benign, but when you think about it, what does natural resources really mean? It means raw materials for the stuff that we want to make, so then we will value them. It's not intrinsic value, it's because it's stuff that we need to transform. Very often, land is understood as capital, isn't it? Because land is understood as property. And let's be clear together what property means. Property means that because you have exchanged currency for this parcel of terrain underneath your feet, you now have rights to it. You have purchased the rights to determine the fate of that piece of land and all the beings who live there. You could care for them tenderly, or you could wreck them. Doesn't matter, because you bought the rights to determine their fate. It's an interesting idea, isn't it? That money could do that. Sometimes we think about land as a source of ecosystem services. Little things like oxygen, clean water, pollinators, soil fertility, climate regulation, the things that the land gives us to make life possible. Would you agree that this is the dominant understanding of what land means when we look at it through the Western paradigm? But let's put on a different pair of glasses. Let's look through the lens of the indigenous worldview and ask ourselves, what does land mean through the eyes of the people whose homelands these are? In many ways of thinking, land is our identity as Native peoples. Many of our names refer to the land that we come from, right? So land is a source of identity. It is who we are. Land is certainly our sustainers, the ones who take care of us, who give us every single thing that we need in order to live. The land is not only our home, but it's the home of our more than human relatives as well. What Western science calls natural resources, we call our relatives, a very different way of thinking. Land is the connection to our ancestors, not only the ancestors who made it possible for us to care for this land, but for the ancestors that we will become, asking that question of what kind of ancestors do we want to be? And what does that look like written on the land? What will the land be that we leave to our descendants? Did you know that in the indigenous worldview, the land is a library, the land is a teacher? This is the source of knowledge, and that we are determined to learn how to learn from the land. But the land is not only the library, it's the pharmacy too. It's the pharmacy because of all of the different medicines that are for healing mind, body, emotion, and spirit. because the land is inspirited, because the land is home. And unlike the Western concept of land as property rights, that's a foreign concept through the Indigenous lens. We would say instead that this is a responsibility-based worldview, that land is the place for which we accept responsibility, not claim rights, because the land is sacred. What a different perspective, a different paradigm on what land means. So if we're going to conserve land, if we're going to restore land, what are we restoring it to? Natural resources or sacred home? That's really the question. Are we talking about land primarily as a source of belongings? Or is it our most profound source of belonging? That's the question. And maybe you've never thought about this before. What does land mean? Probably you haven't, because when we're living in a paradigm, we don't even know it. We just think, well, that's just the truth, right? And so I ask you to think about, how has your worldview been colonized? What made you think that land is property versus sacred home? That land is natural resources versus teacher and healer? How has your worldview been colonized? What are the consequences of these differing views of what land means? And most importantly, what are you going to do about it? And that's really our question for this evening. Because as you know, every acre of land here on Turtle Island are Indigenous homelands. What does the earth ask of us when we are, as settlers, occupying Indigenous homelands with all these levels of meaning? I think what the earth asks of us is justice making. And this is a gift that human beings have, of making justice. What would that even look like? You know, we know that settler colonialism sought to erase our languages, sought to erase our way of caring for the land, our way of understanding the land. Would manifest destiny be possible if the settlers thought of the land as sacred home and provider? No. It was imperative that land was understood as natural resources and as property. Land as a thing, as object, not as subject. This is why the boarding schools tried to erase our languages and our cultures, because these ways are incompatible with the colonial enterprise. You know this story, how every single acre of what is today called the United States and was originally our homelands became public lands and private lands, so that you see today the tiny fraction of our Indigenous homelands over which we have sovereignty and control today. Especially here in the West, let's just take a nod at public land. When we look at public lands, and this map only shows federal public lands, in the East we have tons of public land as well, but it's more under state control, not federal control, so you don't see it on this map. But where these so-called public lands that are owned by the citizens of the United States, let's remember whose lands those are. This sign means a lot to me in the Schneebeck National Forest. National Forest, Forest Service, that's public land, isn't it? It's there for the harvest of trees and wood and watersheds and recreation and all of those things. I'm sorry, but the Schneebeck National Forest is Potawatomi homelands. Those are our tribal lands, which were usurped and taken and became public lands. Our homelands became someone else's homelands. You probably know that throughout this country, this is the story of many parks and public lands, some of the most important, powerful places on the continent that were set aside for national parks, for example, and other kinds of public lands, came at the expense of removing Native peoples from those lands. When we think about the injustices associated with that and the harm associated, think about removing people from land who view the land as their sacred responsibility. right? That's the original wound of the forming of the United States. So what would justice for the land look like when we face up to these hard truths that we all inherit in a settler society? What does justice for the land look like? Justice means so many different things, doesn't it, in different cultural contexts and different settings. But the way that I like to think about it is through a Anishinaabe lens of what does justice look like, and that is restorative justice. In Anishinaabe settings, we think about justice as healing, justice as restoring right relationship and balance, of healing the wound through reciprocity. And I love this piece of art, Manifest Destiny in reverse. What would that look like? That's what I want you to think about. What would justice making for the land look like when we think seriously about our footprint, cultural and ecological, here on Turtle Island? So we don't have time tonight to talk about all the implications of this, but let's just imagine together, what could that look like? How do we make things right given this original wound of colonialism? Restoration, absolutely, we'll get there. Rematriation that we talked about in a wonderful class this morning, creating protected cultural areas, areas that are not just protected for US citizens for recreation, but are protected for cultural access and cultural practice for Native peoples. Meaningful consultation with tribal nations about the management of those lands, indigenous land trusts. There's all kinds of brilliant solutions that are arising and more to come. But as was said so eloquently by Dave at the beginning, we have to go beyond land acknowledgement. Because when we think about what land acknowledgement is, it's like, yep, I've got your cell phone. I acknowledge that I have your property. Thank you for laughing. I mean, is that enough? Is that enough? Right? Don't you want it back? Don't you want it back? Shouldn't there be some kinds of justice associated with that? How do we go beyond acknowledgement to justice? And David Troyer, in a brilliant and controversial article in The Atlantic a couple of years ago, wrote that for Native peoples, there can be no better remedy for the theft of land than land. And he calls for land back, for land justice in return of public lands, for the access and the original caretakers of those lands. I urge you to read that article. Where I live in Onondaga territory, land back is happening. The state of New York is giving, isn't that nice of them? Lands are being returned to their original caretakers, the Onondaga Nation. Yeah. Land back is happening all over the country. It can happen here. It is happening here in the Pacific Northwest. And as a community of learners, people interested in justice and restoration, how can we participate in the various meanings of land back? I challenge you to think about that, particularly as an activist educational institution occupying lands that are indigenous homelands. How is land back enacted? I want to say just for a second, as a conservation biologist, as a restoration ecologist, that we need to recognize that the very goods, the real good of biological conservation and species protection and land protection, which we all uphold as desirable goals. It's something that when we say, what does the land ask of us? To protect those lands, to restore those lands. But let's remember that so much of that conservation has taken place in a Western colonized framework that removes Native people from those places, which ignores the fact that Native peoples have been practicing Indigenous science and land care in our homelands since time immemorial, and that access for land care is just as important. You think about the wonderful work that's going on with things like cultural burning and the return of cultural burning for the health of our lands. That's the application of Indigenous science. But for a long time, fire suppression was the practice, and Native people were being thrown in jail for practicing what the Forest Service does today. And it's, as an Indigenous scientist, it is always gratifying to find out when Western science is catching up with Indigenous science. So much more to say, but I don't really have time. One of the things that is important to say is the worldview that underpins Western conservation. And what you're looking at here in this diagram is the fictional pyramid of human exceptionalism, which is a hallmark of the Western worldview, right? That says of the 200 million species that are on the planet, one of those species, and please note some of one of those species, is more entitled to the riches of the world than any other. And so this is the thinking that gives us land as property, land as natural resources. What would it be like if we decolonized our worldview of human exceptionalism to think about the kinship worldview? The worldview of the democracy of species, of interrelationship. And that's part of the challenge of learning to see through multiple lenses. This is to imagine what would it be like if we thought this about the world. So that's what I want to do for the rest of my time this evening, is to say, what would the land look like if we engaged with the kinship worldview rather than the Western human exceptionalism? What would restoration look like if it was inspired by the Indigenous worldview? And I've worked in restoration ecology for a long time, and I have to tell you that one of the things you learn really quickly in doing restoration ecology is it's not the land that's broken, right? It's our relationship to land that is broken. Filling a sacred Onondaga lake with mercury and PCBs, that's not the lake's fault. Right? That's the sign of a broken relationship. So yeah, we have to clean up all those toxins, but we also have to clean up our relationship and reshape it so that we can have longevity of right relationship with place. Oh, sorry, I can see that slide, but you couldn't. So this, again, this notion that our work in restoration ecology has to be to heal relationship as well as healing the land. But as a Western-trained scientist, I think about SEK, scientific ecological knowledge. And is that what Western science is for? Is Western science all about relationships? Well, in ecology, yes, it is. But is it about human subjective relationships? Thank you. You're just like, no, we didn't learn that in my science class. You did not, because that's beyond the scope of Western science. That's not what we're about. So to achieve this goal of not only healing land, but healing our relationship with land, we need a symbiosis of ways of knowing. We need Indigenous science and Western science. Both of these powerful intellectual traditions for healing land and relationship, and yet almost all of our education has been through the Western lens. Right? Again, you all laughed when I said, well, so you learned about the Nagan Gebejik Mkwan in your conservation classes, right? And of course you didn't, because it's been erased. And again, this is a call to think of how much more powerful would our healing tools be if we looked at the world through multiple lenses. And these are just two lenses. What I really want to do is think about, the eye of a fly, right? With all those different facets, how much richer would our environmental problem solving be if we had multiple facets and multiple paradigms with which to problem solve. So Kenny Ausubel, the founder of Bioneers, this quote goes down in the category of, dang, I wish I'd written that. We're going to need the enduring knowledge of Indigenous science as well as the best of leading edge Western science. It's high tech meets high tech. And this is the dream. This is the goal. And it is no longer just a dream. In my long time in working in this arena, I never thought I would see the day. But almost 2 years ago now, the Biden administration had a federal memorandum, binding memorandum, that says all federal land management agencies must now elevate traditional ecological knowledge in land care decision making. What? And now we have to do it. Because there's finally recognition that indigenous nations are the sources of new models for restoration. I think about the Menominee Forest in Wisconsin and forestry practices here in the state of Washington on tribal lands as well that are forward-thinking models of how economic well-being and ecological well-being can go hand in hand. The wolf restoration work at Nez Perce, with a combination of fish and wildlife science and traditional science. The work in the desert, in the southwestern forest, of using cultural burning and Forest Service learning. Here, of course, the wonderful work in using treaty rights and traditional knowledge to protect salmon and salmon watersheds. Ecosystem restoration led by indigenous nations is a form of land justice that we can actively support. And as we said, what does justice for the land look like? Remember, we had these ways of thinking about it. And Anishinaabe concepts of justice are about gift giving. In this birch bark scroll, what you see is justice being achieved by gift giving. So we're back to that notion of an educated person giving their gifts as an act of justice. I'm going to skip ahead just a tiny bit here. So what does justice for the land look like? It looks like restoration. And traditional ecological knowledge is really being embraced as an element of ecological restoration because, of course, one of the first jobs of a restoration ecologist is to set forward the reference ecosystem. What are we restoring it to? What it looked like at the end of the last glaciation? What it looked like before they built that smelter? What are we talking about here? And so traditional ecological knowledge can be really important in establishing what we think the land ought to look like. In the bad old days, we thought, well, it was pristine. It was pristine, untouched by human hands. That's what we want to restore. But that's just nonsense because, of course, Native peoples using indigenous science and land management techniques had hands on the land, for sure, in producing biodiversity through indigenous land management. So that means we have to restore cultural relationships at the same time as we're restoring the land itself. So identifying the reference ecosystems is a powerful way that indigenous knowledge is engaged in restoration. Here's one of my favorite examples. You see the prairies here of Bekeshwanong First Nation, also known as Walpole Island First Nation. And biologists from all over the world flock to Bekeshwanong because it has all of the species that tallgrass prairies ought to have. They're all there. High ecological integrity, whereas they've dwindled away in so many other places. You say, well, why is that? Why is this place so rich? It's so rich because there is an uninterrupted history of indigenous stewardship of that place, a sophisticated cultural burning that has generated and maintained biodiversity. Another example of the way that indigenous knowledge is important in conservation and restoration. Do you know this beautiful, handsome beast right here? This is the desert tortoise. And it's an endangered species, and so when fish and wildlife experts said, we need to have critical habitat, we need to have recovery, restoration areas for this animal. But in fact, the animal was so rare they didn't really even know what it needed. So in a story shared with me by my friend Gary Nabhan, he says he brought along a Tohono O'odham biologist with him who mostly spoke her own language, and she was quiet on this trip as they went from place to place thinking, is this the critical habitat for for a desert tortoise. And he was kind of discouraged that she wasn't adding more to the discussion until they came to this one valley. It was covered with these flowers. And she spoke up, she said, "In my language, the name of this plant is desert tortoise eats it." Exactly. Exactly. Indigenous languages as a library of knowledge and relationships, we need to look at the world through both lenses, right? So when we think about restoration ecology and restoration philosophy, it began in the bad old days when it was called reclamation. Did you know, and it used to be that in the days when a coal mining company or a mining company is usually involved here, when they left behind all these tailings, left behind a big mess, and there was no obligation to clean it up, nothing. Until they passed the Surface Mine Reclamation Act, which said you need to get something green growing on that. That is not okay. You just can't leave that mess way before restoration ecology existed. So those mining companies had to post a bond in a capitalist society, and let's say they put up $10 million. And if they got something green to grow on that land, they'd get their $10 million back at the end of 5 years or something. So what did they do? They imported topsoil, they planted alfalfa, and they turned on the irrigation. And 5 years later, alfalfa was growing there, and they got their $10 million back. And then they walked away and turned off the irrigation, and then it was a mess again, right? That's so-called reclamation. That's not restoration. And so the era of reclamation was replaced by the era of restoration. And you see here in this statement from the Western scientific perspective, the National Research Council says that restoration has to emulate nature. You have to return the ecosystem to close proximity of what it looked like pre-disturbance, and it wasn't alfalfa. So you have to return structure and function, okay? So much better. The restoration laws and policies are orders of magnitude better. And so we can feel pretty satisfied with this way of being. And yet, if we take the indigenous science lens and look at this, we see that there are two views of ecological restoration, at least. One put forward, as we just saw, by the National Research Council, that says, fix it, fix the structure, and fix the function. Really important. But the Indigenous Peoples Restoration Network came forward and said, what you have to fix first is relationship. Fix relationship to land, and then work in partnership with the intelligence and the brilliance and the wisdom of the land as a healer itself. And how can we partner with our more than human relatives to achieve these goals of land healing? It's going to take generations. It isn't an imposed solution that engineers say, oh yeah, we want this to look like this, and so we're going to bring in all of the equipment and the seeding and make it look like we want it to look. And then keep it that way. The indigenous perspective is that the land is alive and dynamic and resilient, and we humans have this gift and responsibility of helping that along. What's more, the Indigenous Environmental Network says that it's spiritual work. This isn't just biophysical work. That ecological restoration is inseparable from cultural and spiritual restoration. It is our spiritual responsibility to care for the land. And so this idea leads us to a whole new way of thinking about restoration, not only fixing structure and function using the tools of Western science, but to use the healing capacity of traditional ecological knowledge for biocultural restoration, which incorporates cultural values and cultural practices in healing the land. So when we add TEK, a second lens to this work, we're talking about biocultural healing. And I think that this, in fact, leads us to, again, I'm running out of time, so I'm going to be a little faster here, to something called reciprocal restoration. And in reciprocal restoration, the notion is that we don't have to just do restoration, we have to do restoration. We have to remember and create a different story about our relationship to place, one about kinship and gifts and responsibilities, not exploitation and natural resources. Restoration means engaging with Native peoples so that their stories of right relationship with place are manifest on the land again. That the story is not the colonial conservation, kick Native people out, but bring Native people back in right relationship to place through land back, through engagement with cultural practices. It also means that we have to tell a different story about the land. How many of you have been to a public space, let's say, and you read the historic kiosk associated with that place? Oh, thank you again for laughing. You know, there's so many of them say, well, this land was first settled by pioneer James Whitlock. I'm like, oh, really? Let's talk about erasure. Restoration means telling the truth. It means, again, acknowledging whose lands these are and the stewardship practices that are there. So this kind of reciprocity is based in land back. You have to have access for your original caretakers for land stewardship and caring. So it can either be physical land back or reuniting the people and the land. To restore subsistence relationships, the land as a source of gifts. That's what restoration looks like. People being back on the land, harvesting our traditional foods and having right relationship with the species who are there, which means restoring tending relationships like burning, for example, and coppicing and pruning and many of our other land care techniques. It means education. It means returning the story of the land, the gifts of the land. It means ceremony. It means bringing the spiritual responsibilities back to our sacred places as well. It means restoration of local livelihoods so that you can once again take care of your family and your culture on your land, restoration of foodways, and restoration of place names. Really important, and something I really value about being here in Washington is how many Indigenous place names are still alive and well, but in many cases they aren't. This is an important act to say what are the place names and to use them. So, to finish up, in this evolution of reciprocity and restoration, we go from reclamation to fixing structure and function, this mechanical, objective, and in many cases very successful Western scientific approach. But then we go beyond it to say, let's rely on cultural values, on language, on stories to help guide our restoration so that we're restoring relationship. And then we move to the realm of reciprocal restoration. Because when you heal the land, when our cultural species are present and thriving on the land, what does that mean? It means that culture can thrive there as well. In order for, in my case, I think about grandparents teaching their grandchildren to gather sweetgrass and sing the sweetgrass songs. There has to be sweetgrass, right? And so when you heal the land and bring back our cultural species, it revitalizes culture. And when you revitalize culture, the practices of care for the land, both pragmatic and spiritual, heal the land as well. And this is reciprocal restoration, the mutually reinforcing healing of land and culture, so that one magnifies the other, that all flourishing is mutual. This is a bigger vision of restoration, reciprocal restoration in knowing that when we heal the land, we are healing ourselves. Miigwech bisintawiyeg. Thank you for listening and thinking together. Thank you. Thank you. You're very kind. I'm going to take that as an endorsement to think together. And I think we're now moving to Q&A, right? With your good, thoughtful questions and scarf retrieval. Oh yeah, over here, huh?
But you're going to acknowledge. Yeah, well, of course, I'm going to acknowledge it. I'm just not going to give it back.
No, of course not.
Do you want the sparkling one? This is fine. It's already open. Okay. So thank you so much for being here. I know I'm not the only one who loved your talk. I looked back because the lights weren't in my eyes, and I could see everybody just amazed and entranced. And the question that I'm going to start with is one that comes, a question I have, so sorry, question I have. That's right, I do. Use the mic. Oh, I'm sitting on the mic. Excellent. You can tell I use a mic a lot. So one thing that I think can discomfort settlers when we talk about land back is they don't know where they fit in, right? Because we're talking about restoration of culture and healing of our cultures. And I think some people are sometimes afraid that that means, oh, we want to do a genocide back. And I'm wondering if you could talk more about what land back means when you talk about it. Where do settlers fit into that?
Yeah, I will be guided in my answer by these powerful words that were associated with the land back work in Onondaga territory. For example, some years ago they filed not a land claim, but what they called a land rights action, the right to care for land. And their goal in getting their land back was to heal the land. The land was full of brownfields and gravel pits and really wrecked places. And so their goal was to have their rights, their ancestral rights, recognized so that they had standing to heal the land. It was an act of restoration. And one of the things that came forward was citizens of our region said, well, does that mean that you're going to kick us off our land? like we did you. At least there's that consciousness, right? And what Onondaga Nation said is they have no intention of displacing anyone because they know the harm that comes from that. Their goal was for healing, healing of the land and healing of relationship with settlers so that settlers could become agents of land justice. This idea that land justice is a public good. When you engage in land justice, you can then feel in right relationship with your neighbors and with the land. And very often, I think there's so many different models and forms of land back, but one of them is related to public land, that it is public land that can be rematriated most fairly, perhaps. Yeah, it would be a way to talk about that.
Thank you. This question just so happens to relate to it. So thank you to the person who wrote the question. So your work suggests that becoming indigenous to place is possible. As a well-meaning white person who tries to teach your work, I'm usually at a loss about how to talk to students about this without appropriation, harm, or any of many other problematic missteps. What do you suggest to help deepen understanding of such a becoming?
Yeah. Well, in that very chapter in Braiding Sweetgrass, you see me wrestle with that language, I start out with thinking about, when one feels indigenous to place, your sense of responsibility and stewardship for that place is so profound that there's, for me, that longing of what if settlers felt that way about the land that they inhabit. But then I go on to think on the page of, which I think is really helpful as we navigate our way through this. You say, I don't really mean become indigenous, because you can't. Indigenous is indigenous. You're here or you're not. You're from here or you're not. But what is it like to behave as if your ancestors passed this place to you? What is it like as if your grandchildren will be inheriting sacred land. It's a what if question, and so the language that I settle on is naturalized, becoming naturalized to place. And this borrows from botany. You know, we have lots of species who are not from here, right? And within the conservation community, there's sometimes this, I find very odd, worry about, oh, well, that's not a native species. It didn't come from here. It's not very good. And I'm like, yeah. But what do we call those species that are not from here, but have become integrated into our ecosystems, that they play well with others, that they're not invasive, they have made good relationships and bring their medicine and their healing gifts to place? What do we call those? Naturalized species. Right? I think the goal is to become naturalized citizens to this place. Not indigenous, but naturalized. Live here as if it mattered. Because it does.
Thank you. This one starts with a quotation, "A bay is a noun only if water is dead." The question is, how do you envision that discussing non-human forms of life as animate will change our ability as humans to reconcile with a changing world, one that needs our respect and attention now more than ever?
I love this question. Why does language matter? Why does this grammar of animacy matter? One of the ways in which this matters a great deal is this idea of the personhood of nature is manifest in the worldwide movement toward the rights of nature. Recognizing this indigenous concept of the personhood of all beings is now finding its way into international and domestic jurisprudence. When you think about the most famous example is from New Zealand, where the Maori for decades were fighting to have the rights of their sacred river recognized by the Crown. And just a few years ago, about 5 years ago now, the rights of the Whanganui River to have legal standing, to be a legal person, were passed in New Zealand. So that river has a voice in whether it's going to be dammed or not, whether it's okay to dump PCBs into it. The river has a voice. So these ideas of animacy and personhood are finding their way into these landmark cases. And of course, you know those landmark cases are happening here in the United States today too, primarily led by indigenous peoples. The Yurok, who changed their tribal constitution to have the Klamath River recognized as a person. And it's not only in indigenous societies. The city of Toledo on Lake Erie passed a referendum to recognize the personhood of Lake Erie. Yeah, municipalities are doing this. The state of Ohio then had a challenge to that, so it's still in the courts. One of my favorite examples is from Ojibwe territory, where our wild rice, our monoman beds, are threatened by oil pipelines, right? And so White Earth Ojibwe passed a resolution, a binding resolution, in tribal court that made monoman or wild rice a legal person. Now, something that you probably know is in this country, you and I get to be legal persons and corporations, right? And so in making monoman, wild rice, a legal person, that means wild rice has legal standing. That means wild rice can take the pipeline companies to court. And she did. It matters.
Yeah.
It matters.
It does. And how interesting to call them landmark cases.
Yes, you're right.
Because the land is with us even when we talk about it.
Yep.
So here's another really thoughtful question. What does restoring a relationship with land look like for someone who also does not have access to their native ancestral language, land, and culture?
Yeah, such an important question. And a lot of my thinking on this was actually motivated by a powerful encounter I had with someone on the Texas border who said, my family has been farming here, ranching sustainably here for, I think he said like 8 generations. And he said, and yet I continue to feel this wound of, I know that my family has been farming on stolen land all of this time. I can't feel at home here because of that original wound. And that broke my heart to think that this family had cared so tenderly for this land all of this time. And it doesn't make it theirs, but they are living in such a way that does honor to the land and honor to the peoples who have been displaced from that place. And so I really think a lot about this question of how do we come home to a sense of belonging when we are newcomers, when we are immigrants, or in this case, 8 generations farmer. And to me, the answer is in reciprocity. How do we become members of a community? By giving to that community, right? Not just by taking, but by giving back. And so all of the ways that we can reciprocate the gifts of the earth are how we come to belong. And that's why this question of what does the earth ask of us in our own gifts and responsibilities are so important, because I think that's how we come to belong. It's how we come to heal. Say, this isn't my land, but I'm going to care for it tenderly as if it was.
Right, to belong to the land.
To belong to the land, exactly.
Yeah. So I've seen multiple versions of this question. So it's next. One of the compelling parts of your writing, one of the most compelling parts of your writing is the use of stories to show larger principles. And I think we've also seen that here tonight and in your speaking about Minoman and the river in Aotearoa, New Zealand. Do you worry ever that these stories and the beings within them will be tokenized or romanticized? How can that be avoided?
Of course I worry about it. Yeah, absolutely. But what I try to do and be really mindful of at all times is what to share. To share the compelling stories that feel to me that they have, I think of them as medicine. They're stories that have so much medicine in them that they can help heal our relationship to place. They are not usually culturally specific practices that belong just to our people. Those I don't share. But those practices and ways of being, which are accessible to us not by virtue of our genealogy or our cultural teachings, but are just part of being a human being. Those are the things that I want to help remind people of. Those things that are our gifts as human people, regardless of where we come from.
I have a follow-on to that. It's so interesting to think about. I mean, we think about so many things as medicine, right? Stories and relations and land and place and water and ceremony. Do you think that when a story or a piece of knowledge or medicine is taken outside of its context, if it takes too many hops away, it can be abused like other medicines can?
Absolutely.
And are there ways that we can help people not do that?
Yes, yes. That's such an important question, and there are many examples of how they have been taken out of context and imported into the Western worldview, and great damage is done. You know, one of the teachings that has always been shared with me in that case is, look what happened to tobacco, right? One of our sacred plants, and you saw what happens, right? So there's lots of cautions around what it is that we share and the guidance that comes with how they are shared. And in fact, in our teachings, oftentimes we're told that we don't share knowledge until we share how to care for that knowledge, how to be responsible for that knowledge. And so that putting sharing into a context of justice, decolonizing your own mind, etc., is, I hope, a way of buffering against some of that abuse. But it's a real risk.
So you're reminding us to be responsible with what we take from the stories. Maybe they give us ease, but it's not only ease that they give us. They also offer us a path towards healing, which can be difficult.
Yes, yes. But that gift is always coupled to responsibility for the gift.
Thank you. What advice, new question, what advice do you have for balancing the sometimes over-technical Western scientific approach to restoration with the responsibility to the earth that aligns more with indigenous science? They sometimes seem at odds with each other.
You know, we talked a lot about this in the class discussion this morning. They are often at odds with one another, but I think of them as complementary approaches. That it's not a matter of choosing one or the other, it's choosing both of those things. And, you know, Western science draws upon our intellectual ways of knowing and our observational ways, our empirical ways, sensing the world. And so does indigenous knowledge draw on those things very powerfully. But indigenous knowledge also draws in emotional intelligence and spiritual knowledge that couples values and ethics to what we know about the world. Mm-hmm. And so what feels very important to me in navigating that space is to be very clear about what science can and can't do, and what indigenous knowledge can and can't do. And I am never talking about blending those knowledge systems. They're sovereign knowledge systems. They have different cultural assumptions, different worldviews, these different lenses that we've been talking about. And so it seems really imperative to not think about blending them, but to use them in parallel, in complementary fashion.
Thank you. This question is, as a teacher, I'm interested in how the relationships between science, I assume Western science, but possibly not, and indigenous knowledge may have changed. What do you see that is different now as opposed to when you began graduate school?
I think the most obvious for me is the visibility of indigenous knowledge. When I began my training as a scientist, there was no space or recognition for other kinds of science or indigenous knowledge at all. And over the decades, thanks to the work of so many indigenous and ally scholars and leaders who have brought forward the importance of traditional knowledge as a valid, evidence-based way of knowing the world has been extraordinary. So things have really changed in visibility and combating anti-erasure. It's a long, long way to go. It feels like what has happened is that door was closed for indigenous knowledge. Now that door, we all put our foot in that door. And now the light's shining through, and there's a whole bunch of indigenous and ally scholars waiting to push it down.
There is. A lot of times, I'm sure you've experienced this a lot, this is a follow-on, indigenous people who are isolated in a settler context, right, at a primarily white institution, or maybe they're one of the only scientists at their institution or on that coast who is also indigenous, are asked to stand on behalf of so many communities. I would love it if you would speak both to what you recommend settlers and aspiring allies can do to support those people, and also to talk to our students about how they can, because we have indigenous students tonight. Hello, Nisa, I see you. Can you talk to them about how to manage that and the burden of education they're expected to bear?
Yeah, it is so common. It's the phenomenon of being the only. The only one. And somehow you're expected to be able to articulate the needs of the 563 different indigenous nations on the continent, in the United States, excuse me. It's a huge burden. It's a huge burden that I think many of us feel. But at the same time, for myself anyway, I also feel it a privilege to be able to share what little I know, and to create community around that with other onlys, with other onlys, and find each other so you're not the only. And that's the advice that I would give. Things like Native student organizations, maintaining cultural connections. I was so glad during my visit here to meet with several different communities, indigenous communities, who can provide that sense of belonging and mutual support that dilutes that burden. So rely, as we always do, on each other. But also recognize that if you're the only voice in the room, tell your story. You know, the advice that I would want to give to my much younger self was that I was very quiet. I thought, well, nobody here thinks like I do. I'm the only. No one will listen. So why will I even say anything? And I really regret that. Maybe it's why I talk so much now. But that idea to use your voice and know your people are standing behind you. And I call on those ancestors all the time. Stand with me, because it's lonesome out there.
It is.
I have at times the worst job in the world. Like this. Dr. Crocker, I know you've had a bunch of questions in your lap, and I wanted to give you the chance to offer one last question before we move on to the reception and food and book signing and more time together. And it hurts my heart to break this off, but thank you both for this time. I'll say my last word. Please join us for the reception. And after the last question, please join me in thanking our wonderful questioner and our wonderful guest. But question first.
Thank you, Dave, for doing the hard work. We appreciate you. All of us, I promise. So this question is, if you had one piece of advice to or request for any farmers on any of the lands that have been your home, what would it be?
Farmers, did you?
Farmers.
Oh. How to choose just one thing? What I want to ask farmers, which for really good farmers you don't have to ask, so it's a hard question, right? And that is to let the plants do their work, right? The notion of cover crops, of we should never have bare soil. We should never have bare soil. We are approaching a terrible, terrible crisis in soil fertility in this country. And care for the soil, and the plants know how to do that. When I flew here, and you fly over farm fields that are bare and blowing away in the fall winds after the dryness, it hurts my heart, it hurts the land. So let the plants do their work. Keep those roots in the ground.
Thank you so much. Chimegwech, Wiblachan, Wehwina.